The laugh still echoes in my head. It wasn't just laughter, it was the sound of someone who believed she had already won. I stood there, watching her fingers button his shirt, each click of the button a hammer driving into my chest. "Of course I slept with your boss," she whispered, smug as a cat stretching in the sun. "How else do you think you got that big promotion?" Her words didn't sting the way she thought they would. No, they lit a fuse. I leaned in close, my lips almost brushing her ear, and whispered back, steady and cold. "Good. Tomorrow's press release will show exactly who signed the receipts." The look on her face shifted instantly, smugness melting into confusion, then a flicker of fear. And in that moment, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. She had no idea the storm I was about to unleash. I never used to question the late nights. At first, I even defended them. When friends asked why he was working so much, why he seemed drained yet strangely restless, I painted the best possible picture. A man dedicated to his career, sacrificing personal time for our future. I wore his ambition like a badge of honor. But ambition smells different when it sours. It lingers on clothes, on skin, in the way someone avoids your eyes. I began to notice the changes in fragments. A shirt collar smelling faintly of perfume I didn't wear. A sudden fondness for cologne he had never cared about before. The constant checking of his phone, always face down, as though it were a secret companion he had to protect from my gaze. One night, I decided to test a theory. Dinner was on the table, his favorite, the kind of meal that should have made him pause, smile, kiss me, and say something about how lucky he was. Instead, he barely glanced at it before muttering about an urgent meeting. He reached for his phone, typed quickly, and shoved it back into his pocket. I followed him that night, my heart hammering so loudly I thought it would give me away. I wasn't sure what I expected, maybe a bar, maybe a late-night office rendezvous with a pile of files. What I found was a hotel. I parked across the street, the engine ticking as it cooled, and watched him walk inside with a woman I recognized instantly. She was everything I was, louder, flashier, draped in confidence like a tailored suit. I didn't need to follow them up to their room. My chest already felt crushed beneath the weight of what I had seen. The betrayal was sharp, yes, but there was something else lurking beneath it. A calculation. I had always prided myself on seeing the patterns others missed, on noticing the details that stitched life together. And in that moment, as I sat alone in the car, I realized I wasn't powerless. The next day, I searched through old folders, company files, and receipts that had once seemed boring, mundane. Hidden among them were trails, subtle inconsistencies in numbers, small but suspicious gaps in expense reports, and receipts signed with a hand that wasn't supposed to have access. Her hand. That was when the shape of my revenge began to form. I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of watching me unravel. No, I was going to burn their little empire to the ground, and I would do it with nothing more than the truth. Still, I played my role. I smiled when he came home late. I laughed when he brushed off his exhaustion with weak excuses. I even kissed him goodnight as if I hadn't already begun collecting every scrap of evidence I needed. The plan came together slowly, like a spider weaving its web strand by strand. I knew where to look, what to copy, and most importantly, how to keep my silence. Because silence is the sharpest blade. And when the time came, I would make sure it cut exactly where it hurt the most. I started small, because small sweeps away complacency better than spectacle. If I had rushed in with shouting and accusations, they would have closed ranks, whispered apologies, and rebuilt the illusion that nothing had happened. Instead, I used the one advantage no one suspected I possessed: patience. He still thought I was the woman who smiled at boardroom victories and stayed quiet while he polished his reputation. She still thought she had the final say, that her laugh could smooth over any consequence. Both of them were wrong. My first move was mundane. I opened a bank account in a name that appeared suspiciously ordinary. I used my maiden initials and an address linked to an old friend who owed me a favor. The account was a staging ground. It would receive small transfers that, if followed, would reveal the architecture of their corruption. I set up a burner email, a phone number that routed to a prepaid SIM, and taught myself how little details could be made to look official. Parallel to that, I became the archivist of our life, only this time, the archives weren't photographs and grocery lists. I cataloged receipts, credit card statements, expense forms, and the snippets of office chatter he left behind in stray messages. I learned the cadence of his calendar meetings, the contractors whose names kept surfacing on invoices, the vendors who seemed to be paid without deliverables. If you trace a lie back far enough, it becomes a map. And maps are meant to be followed. The woman in the hotel had been careless, too theatrical, too eager to be seen. That arrogance left fingerprints. She had insisted on putting everything on expense reports that were routed through his department, and she had used a signature stamp that matched an authorized signatory in a way that wouldn't be immediately obvious to anyone scanning for simple red flags. But for someone who knew where to look, the anomalies were blatant. I made copies. Not just digital ones, but physical copies, because paper is unforgiving. I arranged them in files, chronologically, like chapters in a crime novel. There were dinner receipts from places that didn't fit the company's vendor list, invoices that referenced services never rendered, tiny reimbursements that, when aggregated, formed a pattern of siphoned funds. I circled names in bright ink. I drew arrows. I wrote notes in the margins, like a detective who had turned her marriage into an investigation. At night I lay awake listening to them, his quiet breathing, her muffled laughter during weekend calls. By day I attended to the smallest acts of domestic normalcy, the grocery list, the calendar invites, the casual texts that asked about work. I became a ghost in my own house, moving among the evidence without leaving fingerprints. They were oblivious because they were too busy congratulating themselves. The real weapon, though, was credibility. No one listens to a woman who raves. No one dismantles an empire because a scorned wife screams. But they listen to the facts. They respond to documentation and deadlines and audits. So I built a narrative out of numbers. I contacted a friend, one of the few I still trusted, who worked in compliance at a rival firm. I didn't tell her everything. I gave her enough: selected documents, patterns, and the sense that someone inside the company was cooking books. She read, frowned, and asked practical questions I had already preempted: audit trails, chain of custody, where the money moved. I gave her that too. Her eyes widened when she saw the signed receipts, and the way a vendor's invoice tied back to a shell company that only existed as a forwarding address on a commercial registry. "Careful," she said, when I finally let her in. "If you want this to stick, you can't make it about emotion. It has to be about breaches authorization, procurement violations, falsified signatures. If you push this through the right channels, you'll force an audit. That's the cleanest way to do it." I smiled. Everything in me wanted to scream, to make them feel the raw humiliation I felt. Instead, I turned the emotional energy into meticulousness. She was right. The company would chew up anything that smelled like a scandal, and it would leave the personal aside if the money trail was clear. Next came the press release plan, a line I had thrown out in anger when I first confronted her in that hotel room, the line she twisted into a taunt. "Tomorrow's press release will show exactly who signed the receipts." At the time it was a threat. Now it would be a method. I would make the press release inevitable. Step 1 was to seed the right people, not bloggers drunk on gossip, not friends who would take sides, but journalists who lived off corporate dramas and loved nothing more than a clean, evidence-backed expose. I compiled a list of business reporters at respectable outlets with a track record for handling corporate misdeeds. I prepared a cover note for each, neutral, precise, and unbreathable with emotion. In the attachment, I included an executive summary and a folder that anyone from a newsroom could verify: timestamps, scanned receipts, emails showing approvals, and the trail to the shell company. I also prepared my armor: a short, tightly worded statement that read like a legal filing. It said nothing inflammatory. It asserted facts, cited documents, and expressed concern for shareholder interests. It contained no swear words, no pleading, no slander. It was clinical, and that was its power. There were nights when I almost gave up. There were mornings when cowardice crept in, and I considered returning everything to the safe darkness of denial. But then, I reminded myself of the humiliation I cataloged the way he looked at me as if my loyalty were a commodity, the way she flaunted her victory. Their audacity to treat the truth like an accessory had to be punished not for cruelty, but for economy. If they could steal from the company, they might steal from anyone. I bought myself time by orchestrating small, convincing distractions. I created scripts for conversations where I feigned ignorance and flirted with naivety. I complimented his tie at a fundraiser while secretly sending encrypted messages to my compliance friend. I offered to host an office dinner so I could meet people, casual acquaintances who, with one casual remark, could be coaxed into remembering a name or a dinner that matched the receipts. People always slip up when they're comfortable. I watched for those slips. One evening, at a company gala, he wore the same watch he'd had when I first loved him, an ostentatious piece that always seemed to say, "I belong here." He smiled for the cameras while I held a glass of water, and smiled for the cameras too, the quiet martyr nobody saw. I used the opportunity to plant a document in the right hand, a printed invoice left on a valet's table, a subtle breadcrumb. By the time the gala ended, the journalist I'd needed had the file. Things accelerated after that. A call came in the late morning. The reporter wanted more. She mentioned a discrepancy, then named the vendor, and asked if I could confirm whether a particular signature matched the authorized signer on payroll. I played dumb, then provided the scanned signature and, when asked, supplied a clean copy from the spreadsheet I'd assembled. Once the journalist had the documents, the machine started to turn. I didn't gloat. I did not dance on the edge of ruin with a triumphant smile. Instead, I continued to perform the role of a woman who loved and who forgave because shadows fall shorter when the light seems steady. I pressed kisses to a brow, adjusted a tie, made the same coffee he liked in the morning. My hands trembled under the calm. They were wrong about me. They assumed their silence shielded them. In private, the dynamics changed. She started texting more frequently after that hotel night, as if victory required constant reinforcement. He became defensive in new, unfamiliar ways. The details I had long noticed, the way his calls shortened, the way he began to schedule meetings, later mutated into paranoia. You can watch guilt like a rot. It eats from the inside out and leaves a different shape to the person who carries it. Then came the audit, arranged not by me, but by people who recognized a story worth following. The company's legal department called his office, their tone professional but cold. He sat across from me that evening as the word, audit, floated between us like a thrown gauntlet. He laughed at first, a nervous sound, trying to turn it into a joke. "It's nothing," he said. "Administrative, just a routine check." "You're worried," I said, and his laugh stopped. He didn't answer. He rubbed his temple like someone suddenly struck with a headache. His silence said what I wanted no one to say out loud, but what everyone already suspected. There was smoke. When the auditors came, they pulled items I had already flagged: the invoices, the strange vendor, the peculiar reimbursements. They asked questions that made his hands fidget. They wanted copies of authorization logs, access to his calendar, explanations for overnight expenses. He produced explanations that slowly deflated under scrutiny. Defense after defense sagged in the face of the documents I had compiled. I watched from an appointed distance. This was not revenge in the cartoonish sense. I didn't want to watch a marriage shred into shards in a way that fed people's appetites for scandal. I wanted the truth to stand, clean and undeniable, the way light does when it cuts through fog. That's why the press release had to be inevitable. I didn't want the story to be a salacious piece about lovers and betrayal. I wanted it to be about governance, about responsibility. A scandal rooted in money can topple kings. And when the auditors found the shell companion entity that existed on paper, and that funneled money through a network of subcontractors, the board's patience evaporated. He called me the night the internal findings were summarized. The call was brief. He said he needed to meet. His voice was small, stripped of the confidence I had once mistaken for character. I put a hand over the phone and listened to the steady rhythm of my own breath. The meeting was scheduled for the following afternoon in the executive conference room. I arrived early, dressed in a way that conveyed unremarkable normality. He came in later, drying his hands on a napkin, moving as if rehearsing a version of himself that could still survive this. She did not come, and I felt a small, cold satisfaction at that absence. Absence is a telling thing. The board moved quickly. They presented a concise list of findings and offered him a chance to resign before they escalated the matter to shareholders and regulators. He shrank under the weight of it. The moment was clinical, surgical, no melodrama, no shouting. That was the beauty of my plan. The system did the punishing. I had turned personal betrayal into corporate accountability. After the board meeting, he walked out like a man who had been denuded. He met my eyes for a brief second, and in them I saw a plea that marriage could no longer hold. He mouthed the word, "Sorry," or perhaps it was, "Help," it was hard to tell. He walked past me with a slow, hollowed gait and left the building without his jacket. I felt nothing, and yet everything. I had achieved the part of victory that mattered, the exposure. The shell had been found, the signatures called into question, and the auditors had flagged cost centers that now required forensic review. The company prepared a statement sterile, factual, and devastating. It described irregularities and breaches of procurement policy and an ongoing investigation. There was no melodrama in it, only accountability. That evening, as newsrooms prepared their morning briefings, I sat at our kitchen table and opened a bottle of wine. I thought about retribution like a ledger, entries in, entries out. There was a balance now, yes, but balancing doesn't erase the wound. The press release would not bring back nights of humiliation, but it would remove their sanctuaries. It would make them answer in public what they had tried to privatize. I thought about her, the woman who had thought her laughter could protect her. I thought about his betrayal, which had been both intimate and petty. And I thought about the line I had said in fury that first night of press release and how it had become, through patience and strategy, a precise instrument. The reporters called at dawn with polite, expectant voices. They had more questions about corporate governance than about love affairs. That was fine. The world loved numbers, because numbers could not be argued with in the way that feelings could. I fed them facts, and they fed them to readers. The story was framed not as a tawdry romance, but as a cautionary tale about what happens when greed disguises itself as ambition. By the time the company issued its statement publicly, the damage had already begun. Stock dipped, board members offered mediated comments, and he retreated to a small apartment a few towns over. She disappeared from the social feeds, which was perhaps the smallest mercy. The life they had built on borrowed trust was compromised. The things that had once offered them protection status, friends, money now offered only exposure. I had wanted justice. I had delivered an unadorned truth and let institutions do the rest. It was not cathartic in the fiery way I had imagined. Instead, it was precise, surgical, and, in its own way, lonely. The loudest part of the aftermath was not the scandal. It was the silence that followed in our home, the hum of appliances, the empty chair at the breakfast bar, the way his shoes no longer lined up next to mine. Revenge had been a promise. The execution was a lesson. The world responded to paper, to signatures, to audits. And in the quiet after the storm had been set into motion, I realized the part of me that had been most satisfied wasn't the part that wanted to see them fall. It was the part that had learned her own strength, the part that knew how to turn fury into method, and to make truth work like a blade. There were more things to come. Legal representatives would call. There would be negotiations, perhaps a lawsuit or a settlement. But the first great move, the one that converted humiliation into accountability, had been made. The press release would not end everything, but it would ensure they could not rebuild in the dark. I poured another glass of wine and looked at the city outside our window. Somewhere, headlights cut across the wet streets. I thought about storms, and about the calm that follows them, not the peace that erases what happened, but the clarity that allows you to see what is left and decide what to do next. When the initial press release landed, it was like dropping a stone into a still pond. The first splash was loud, but the ripples kept widening long after. The company's legal team moved with the calm ferocity of people trained to do damage control. My phone lit with calls I barely answered. I let them. This was no longer my private where it had become a joint operation with the law and with watchdogs, who loved paperwork almost as much as I did. Suddenly, every email I'd copied, every receipt I'd circled in bright ink, mattered in a way that felt almost sacred. They sent letters turned formal and unreadable to anyone who didn't live inside legalese. He found a lawyer whose jaw was as sharp as the retainer they demanded. She went quiet for a while, then popped back into view with glossy denials on social media and thinly veiled shots at reputation. Their friends splintered along predictable lines. Some offered awkward platitudes, others fled like moths from a dying flame. I expected the humiliation to be loud, and in many ways it was. He lost more than a title. He lost the comfortable certainty that people would always assume the best of him. Board members, who had once toasted his success, now guarded their responses with the care of people distancing themselves from rot. The woman's name, her face started appearing in articles that were careful but pointed. The kind of exposure she had thought glamorous curdled into something else. A trial by public opinion that chewed up the performative confidence she worn like perfume. The legal process became my new rhythm. There were depositions, subpoenas, more documents, pages that smelled faintly of printer ink and old coffee. I sat through hours of testimony, listening to men and women in suits parse out the timeline of payments as if they were dissecting a clock. I had rehearsed my answers. I had sat with my compliance friend and a lawyer and learned how to state facts without seasoning them with anger. People who tried to bait me into emotional territory found only a measured voice and an immovable set of dates and signatures. But legal consequences aren't the only consequences that matter. There is a particular kind of damage that thrives in living rooms and at dinner tables, where reputations dissolve into small, corrosive acts of gossip. I could have left everything to the auditors and the press, but there was another ledger I wanted balanced, the social one. Money and status had given them a private stage on which to perform their betrayals. I wanted them to feel the ordinary embarrassment of being watched by circles that had once celebrated them. So I began to orchestrate smaller exposures, less journalistic bombshells, and more surgical embarrassments. I compiled emails that showed the woman had lied to people in the industry about her role in projects. I forwarded certified copies of correspondence to a few select industry contacts, people whose influence could quietly close doors. I didn't smear. I presented verifiable facts and let the market decide. Within months, invitations stopped arriving. She found herself being excluded from panels, from networking lunches, from the casual privileges that keep careers afloat. He felt it too, in different, grimmer ways. The next time he tried to attend an alumni event, he noticed the polite, thin smiles and the careful distance people kept. Old colleagues began offering statements of support to the company rather than to him. Their sympathies were cautious, measured. It is a strange thing to be abandoned by the scaffolding you once leaned on without question. I watched him learn humility in public, an awkward, expensive kind that no amount of money can buy back. There were private reckonings too. At some point, he demanded we meet alone. He arrived like someone trying on apologies for size, asking if there was any way to fix what he had broken. He spoke of stress and poor judgment and the fog of ambition. He said the word sorry until it was thin and overused. I studied him the way I had once studied spreadsheets, searching for inconsistencies in his remorse. I told him the truth, that sorry was a good start, but not the thing that erased what had been done. I told him about the phone calls I had answered alone, the nights I had stayed awake translating receipts into a narrative that could stand in court. I told him that forgiveness could exist only if he stripped away the arrogance that led him to believe he could live two lives without consequences. He listened like someone being sentenced, and then asked if I would accept a mediated resolution, money, privacy, a clean exit. The lawyer's room smelled like old leather and quiet calculations. They offered option after option, settlements framed as pragmatic, non-disclosure agreements that promised silence in exchange for a check. I thought about the money not because I wanted compensation for pain, but because money moves differently now that the world had seen the truth. A payout could buy us time. A non-disclosure could protect us from further probing. There was merit in discretion. But there was also a principle I hadn't anticipated. I wanted accountability that didn't hide behind hush money. So I refused the easy route. I demanded something that made the lawyers fidget, a formal admission of breach, corporate oversight on procurement, and a commitment to fund retraining programs for compliance across the company. Call it idealism. Call it a strategic move to ensure the wrong couldn't be repeated. It felt good to use the leverage I had assembled for something structural, not just punitive. Some nights were unbearable. I walked through the house with boxes, packing his things with a care that felt odd and intimate. Packing felt like closure and betrayal at the same time. I found collars with perfume traces that still clung to fabric, receipts shoved behind books, little tokens of a life that had become foreign. Packing didn't fix anything, but it made the fact of departure tactile. When I closed the last box and labeled it office/return, I felt a hollowing that was not victory. It was a recognition that the life I had known had been dismantled, and that whatever came next would be built from different materials. In the midst of this, she reached out to me, part apology, part negotiation via a muted direct message with language that tried to thread humility and hubris together. I ignored it for days, not because I wanted to punish her further, but because any engagement risked turning our conflict into spectacle. When I finally replied, it was short and measured. I told her the truth, that her choices had consequences, and that some doors would close because of them. I offered no moralizing, only a practical truth: rebuild or do not, but do not expect a stage to applaud your return. Her career teetered in the months that followed. I watched updates trickle and retractions, quiet removals from projects, people declining collaborations without explanation. The industry is small, and small silences compound. I did not celebrate every closed door. That would have been petty. But I noticed, with a private satisfaction I could not quite name, that the woman who had laughed in my presence no longer had the same appetite for public performance. There was an odd corollary to all this procedural justice. I found people showing up in surprising ways. Friends I had thought distant offered support meals on the doorstep, messages that read simply, "I'm here." My compliance friend became a steady presence, bringing a competence that felt almost like healing. There were other women, quiet, watchful, who reached out to say they had once been in similar positions and wanted to help. The solidarity was small but real. It suggested that while betrayals are private, recovery can be communal. And then, something I had not planned for: empathy. He called once, months after his exit, with a voice that had the thinness of someone who had been stripped of certainty. He asked if he could see minute to win me back, he insisted, but to speak one last truth. I agreed, more out of curiosity than grace. When we met, the conversation was neither cathartic nor cinematic. It was ordinary, about what had happened, about the lies that had been told, about the slow erosion he had not noticed. He told me about waking up in this small apartment and realizing, day by day, that the life he had taken for granted was gone. There was no pleading, only a quiet acceptance that some bridges, once burned, cannot be walked back. There was, too, a moment that surprised me. He asked if I was angry. It was a small, childlike question, as if he could not comprehend the scale of his impact. I answered honestly, I was changed. I had been humbled into a new kind of clarity. I was not the same woman who had watched him smile in boardrooms and attribute all good things to him, and that, in its own way, felt like a different kind of survival. The legal machinery kept turning. The company imposed changes. Some people were fired, some were suspended, and a small group of executives were tasked with rebuilding trust. It was messy and imperfect. No system of accountability is flawless, especially when it must balance reputations and finances. But I felt a wedge had been driven between their misdeeds and their ability to hide behind titles. At night, when the city settled, I would sometimes walk along streets that no longer felt like the backdrop to our life together. I learned small rituals of solitude, a particular cafe that made the kind of coffee I liked, a bench in the park where the light slanted perfectly at dusk. I practiced the unglamorous work of becoming someone who could live in a world that had been altered by betrayal and still keep her center. There were moments when the desire to see them broken in every possible way tempted me. Revenge has an elegance and fantasy, quick, clean, utterly satisfying. Real life is messy. I realized revenge without purpose is hollow. It fills a gap only briefly. What sustained me was the thought that the structures that allowed them to act with impunity had to be changed. That was the real victory, not a dramatic fall from grace for the sake of spectacle, but a reweaving of rules, so the same pattern could not be repeated easily. As winter thinned and spring made tentative promises, settlements were reached, statements made, and the public interest waned. News stories took their place in headlines. The glare dimmed. The woman stopped appearing in articles. He moved to a different city. Both of them carried the cost of their choices in quieter, more private currencies. I stood in the middle of the debris they had made and did what people do after storms. I cleared what I could, salvaged what mattered, and started slowly to replant. There would be one more moment of Closuria's scene that was not grand, but that felt appropriately final. But I held that back, waiting for the last part of the story to settle into place. The reckoning had been public and private, legal and social. It had taught me how to translate fury into method, and it had shown me that justice, when pursued with patience and clarity, can be precise enough to dismantle the opportunistic and sturdy enough to build something new. When the dust settled enough to see clearly, I would decide what to keep and what to let go. For now, I let the silence in the house be an honest thing, not empty, but available for a new kind of conversation I had not yet learned how to have. The silence was the strangest part. For months, my life had been full of noisy lawyers' voices dissecting details, the relentless ping of journalists' questions, the sound of my own pen scratching against paper as I pieced together every receipt, every inconsistency. When it was over, the quiet pressed in like fog. At first, I didn't know how to live without the tension. The absence of constant scheming felt like stepping off a ship after weeks at sea. My legs still swayed, bracing for storms that no longer came. I kept expecting my phone to ring with another demand, another question, another reminder that the world had its eyes on me. But the world moves quickly. Scandals fade. People hunger for the next downfall, the next drama. What lingered was not the scandal itself, but the residue of it. The house felt different. The spaces he once filled were now mine, though I wasn't sure I wanted them. His jacket no longer hung on the chair by the door. His shoes no longer lined the hallway. Yet sometimes, in the half-dark of early morning, I swore I could still hear the faint rustle of his breathing. Ghosts are not always supernatural, they are the echoes of people who live too loudly in your life. I thought the end would bring relief. Instead, it brought a rawness I hadn't prepared for. Victory, I learned, is a blade with two edges. Yes, I had exposed them. Yes, their empire of lies had collapsed in full view of the world. But justice doesn't restore what was lost. It only acknowledges it. For a while, I lived in routines so small they felt like survival. I took morning walks in the park near our old office, letting the air bite against my skin. I brewed coffee slowly, savoring the smell, the warmth of the mug against my palms. I filled notebooks with thoughts that spilled out too tangled to speak aloud. Some days, I convinced myself I was free. Other days, I felt trapped in the shadow of a life that wasn't mine anymore. People asked questions, of course. Friends, neighbors, colleagues. Some asked politely, some with a hungry gleam of gossip. I answered carefully, always measured, always precise. I refused to let them reduce me to the caricature of a scorned wife. My story was not a soap opera, it was a lesson in power, betrayal, and the cost of silence. And yet, in private, I let myself feel everything I had hidden while I plotted. The grief came in waves. Not just grief for the man I had lost, but for the woman I had been before I discovered the truth. She had been naive, trusting, eager to believe that loyalty was enough to protect her. I mourned her most of all. As months passed, I began to build something new. It wasn't dramatist, it didn't need to be. I enrolled in classes, learning skills I had once put aside in favor of supporting him. I reconnected with friends I had neglected, women who carried their own scars and offered laughter that felt like medicine. I traveled short trips at first, then longer ones. I wandered through markets in cities where no one knew my name, and for the first time in years, I felt light. Occasionally, whispers of him reached me. Rumors of jobs he tried to land but couldn't, projects that slipped through his fingers. I didn't chase the details. I didn't need to. His downfall was not my sustenance. Knowing he was no longer untouchable was enough. As for her, she seemed to vanish altogether, her once bright presence dimming into obscurity. The stage she had fought so hard to claim no longer wanted her performance. One day, months after everything, I received a letter. Not an email, not a text, but an actual letter. His handwriting. It was short. No excuses, no explanations. Just an admission. I thought I could live 2 lives. I was wrong. You deserve better. I read it once, then again, then tucked it into a drawer. It was not forgiveness, but it was an ending. And endings matter. The press release had done its work. The auditors had done theirs. The world had moved on. Now it was my turn. So I began to write, not for revenge, not for exposure, but for myself. I wrote the story of what happened in my own words, without the filter of headlines or legal language. I wrote about betrayal, about silence, about how power can be both weapon and shield. I wrote about how survival doesn't mean emerging unscarred, it means learning to live with the scars. And as I wrote, I realized something I hadn't seen before. This wasn't just the story of what they did to me. It was the story of what I did in return. How I refused to crumble, how I wielded truth like a blade, how I turned humiliation into a strategy that shook the walls they thought indestructible. The woman I had been before, the one who smiled at boardroom victories and ignored the late nights, she was gone. In her place stood someone new. Someone who knew her own strength. Someone who no longer mistook silence for safety. The world may never remember the scandal the way it remembered others. But I would never forget the lesson that betrayal does not define you, what you do with it does. And so, in the quiet aftermath, I chose to define myself not by the wreckage, but by the rebuilding. Because storms may tear down walls, but they also clear the sky. And under that cleared sky, I finally began to breathe again.